Chapter 1. The Madness Vampire. The village of Holt in Norfolk, UK, was a picturesque place, known for its charming streets and serene countryside. But as night fell, a shadow moved through the quiet lanes, unseen and unheard. This was no ordinary shadow. It was a harbinger of madness, a vampire that fed not on blood, but on the sanity of its victims. In a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village, a middle-aged man named Harold Martin lay asleep. His life had been one of routine and quiet contentment, but recently his nights had become haunted by disturbing dreams. Each time he closed his eyes, he was drawn into a nightmarish realm where a dark figure lurked, slipping into his subconscious and draining his sanity bit by bit. Harold's eyes fluttered open in the middle of the night, his body drenched in sweat. He sat up, gasping for breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. The dreams were getting worse, more vivid and terrifying. He could barely recall the details, only the feeling of a presence, dark and malevolent, feeding on his mind. Days turned into weeks, and Harold's condition deteriorated. He became irritable and paranoid, his once bright eyes now clouded with fear and confusion. He stopped going to the local pub, stopped greeting his neighbours. The isolation only deepened his descent into madness. One evening, as the sun set and the village was bathed in twilight, Harold sat in his living room, staring blankly at the television. The images on the screen seemed to blur and twist, a reflection of his fractured mind. He tried to stay awake, knowing that sleep would bring the vampire back, but exhaustion claimed him. In his dream, the vampire appeared again, its form shifting and indistinct. It whispered to Harold, filling his mind with dark thoughts and unrelenting fear. The creature thrived on his terror, growing stronger as Harold's sanity slipped away. The line between dream and reality began to blur, and Harold couldn't tell if he was awake or still trapped in the nightmare. His behavior grew more erratic. He ranted about shadows and whispers, about eyes watching him from the darkness. His friends and neighbors tried to help, but nothing could reach him through the haze of madness. He was lost, a prisoner of his own mind, and the vampire's grip tightened with each passing night. One fateful night, Harold woke up screaming, his body convulsing with fear. He stumbled out of bed, running through the darkened house, tearing at his hair. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows mocking his desperation. In his mind, he heard the vampire's voice, taunting him, driving him to the brink of insanity. Unable to take it any longer, Harold ran out of his house into the cold night, screaming for help. His cries echoed through the village, but no one came. They had grown used to his outbursts, dismissing them as the ravings of a madman. But Harold's screams were not in vain. They reached the ears of Captain Damian and Professor Archer, who had just arrived in Norfolk. Following reports of mysterious cases of madness, they exchanged a grim look, knowing that their hunt had just begun. The vampire had chosen its prey well, but it had not accounted for the tenacity and skill of the Night Slayer and his trusted ally. As they prepared to face this new threat, they knew that the battle for Harold's sanity and the safety of the entire village was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Asylum's Curse. In the grim and shadowed halls of Blackwood Asylum, built in the 1800s, the cries of the tormented echoed through the cold stone walls. It was a place where society's unwanted were sent to be forgotten, where madness was treated with cruelty rather than compassion. The methods used to treat insanity were barbaric, often causing more harm than good. Restraints, ice baths, and electroshock therapy were common, leaving patients broken and lost. Among the asylum's unfortunate residents was an old man named Ezekiel Thorn. Once a respected landowner in Holt, Norfolk, Ezekiel had been accused of madness by his own family. They coveted his land and wealth and had him committed to the asylum to seize his property. He was dragged away, screaming that he was sane, but his cries fell on deaf ears. As the staff forced him into a cell, "I am not mad. My family did this to me for my land." The staff exchanged weary glances. "That's what they all say," one of the attendants muttered, shaking his head. Ezekiel's treatment was harsh and relentless. They used restraints to bind him, ice baths to shock his system, and crude electrotherapy to subdue his protests. Each session left him more despondent, more disconnected from the reality he desperately clung to. One day, they subjected Ezekiel to a particularly brutal session. They tied him to a chair, placed a metal helmet on his head, and administered powerful electric shocks. His screams were heart-wrenching, echoing through the asylum, but the staff remained unmoved. As the shocks coursed through his body, Ezekiel's cries turned to desperate pleas. "I'll make you all pay for this," he shouted, his voice filled with rage and pain, but his threats were ignored, seen as the ravings of a madman. The treatments continued until Ezekiel was reduced to a docile, unresponsive state. He sat in his cell, staring blankly at the walls, a shell of the man he once was. His spirit broken, he no longer fought against his captors. Years passed, and Ezekiel Thorn faded into obscurity, his story forgotten by the world, but his curse lingered, a dark presence that would eventually resurface. The madness that consumed him did not die with his body. It lingered, festering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Ezekiel's story was a dark chapter in the history of Holt, a tale of greed, betrayal, and suffering. The echoes of his pain and rage seeped into the very fabric of the village, lying dormant, waiting for a chance to exact revenge. Chapter 3. The Hospital. Captain Damian Knight and Professor Archer stood in the sterile, dimly lit corridor of the local hospital, the beeping of machines and muffled voices creating a tense backdrop. They had followed the ambulance that had rushed Harold Martin to the hospital, hoping to find some answers about the strange madness that had claimed him. As they waited outside the emergency room, an older doctor approached them, his expression weary but kind. "You must be the ones asking about Harold Martin." "Yes," Damian replied. "We need to know what happened to him. His condition seemed unnatural." The doctor nodded, his eyes reflecting a hint of recognition. "Harold was my patient, and I knew his grandfather. In fact, Harold's great-grandfather was a doctor here many years ago. He was one of the founders of this hospital." Professor Archer's curiosity was piqued. "His great-grandfather? Could you tell us more about him?" The doctor gestured for them to follow. "Come with me. There's something you should see." They walked through the hospital corridors until they reached a large, ornate painting on the wall. It depicted a stern-looking man standing proudly in front of Blackwood Asylum. The plaque beneath the painting read, "Dr. Charles Martin, founder of Blackwood Asylum and Holt General Hospital." Dr. Charles Martin was a significant figure in this community, the older doctor explained. He helped establish both the asylum and this hospital. Unfortunately, his legacy is tainted by the methods used in the asylum. It was a place of great suffering. Damian and Archer exchanged a glance, understanding the gravity of this new connection. At that moment, a nurse approached them, her face grave. "I'm sorry to inform you, but Harold Martin has passed away. His mind, he just gave up." Damian's jaw tightened. "Thank you for letting us know," he said to the nurse before turning to Professor Archer. "We need to check out that asylum. There's something there, something connected to all of this." The doctor overheard their conversation and added, "Be careful. The asylum has been abandoned for many years, but its history is dark and filled with sorrow." Damian nodded. "We will. Thank you, Doctor." As they left the hospital, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Harold's great-grandfather, Dr. Charles Martin, the connection between the past and the present was becoming clearer, and the path led straight to the forsaken halls of Blackwood Asylum. With determination in their hearts and the weight of history on their shoulders, Damian Knight and Professor Archer prepared for their next move. The truth behind the madness awaited them, and they would stop at nothing to uncover it. Chapter 4. The Phantom's Vengeance. The village of Holt lay shrouded in darkness, the night air thick with an eerie silence. Shadows danced along the cobbled streets, cast by the flickering lamplights. Among these shadows, a single entity moved with a ghostly grace, its presence almost imperceptible. This was no ordinary being. It was the spirit of Ezekiel Thorn, a vengeful wraith searching for retribution. The figure glided through the village, its form shifting and blending with the night. It arrived at a piece of land that had once belonged to Ezekiel Thorn, a sprawling estate, now reduced to a single modern home. The land had been sold off years ago by Ezekiel's relatives, who had betrayed him for the promise of wealth. The spirit paused outside the house, its ethereal form barely visible in the moonlight. Through the window, it watched a family gathered around the dining table, their laughter and warmth filling the room. A father, mother, and 2 children sat together, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the chandelier. The happiness they shared was palpable, a stark contrast to the torment Ezekiel had endured. For a brief moment, the spirit's malevolent aura seemed to waver. A faint smile crossed its shadowy visage, a remnant of the humanity it once possessed. These were not the people who had wronged him. They were innocent, their joy untouched by the darkness of the past. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. The spirit turned away from the window, leaving the family undisturbed. Its purpose was clear, and its path was set. It sought out those who had betrayed it, those who had condemned Ezekiel to a life of madness and suffering. As it moved through the village, the spirit's presence grew colder, the air around it thick with an unnatural chill. It remembered the faces of those who had wronged it, the greed and deceit that had led to its downfall. The descendants of these traitors still lived in Holt, their bloodlines tainted by the sins of their ancestors. The spirit searched the night, its senses keen and unrelenting. It knew where to find them, drawn to the echoes of their malevolent deeds. Each step it took brought it closer to its goal, the thirst for vengeance burning brightly within its spectral heart. The village was unaware of the darkness that stalked its streets, the phantom of Ezekiel Thorn, driven by a rage that spanned generations. It was a being torn between the remnants of its humanity and the all-consuming desire for revenge. As the night deepened, the spirit's search continued. The laughter and warmth it had witnessed were distant memories, overshadowed by the haunting visions of its own torment. The time for reckoning was at hand, and the phantom would not rest until those who had wronged it paid the ultimate price. The villagers of Holt slept soundly in their beds, oblivious to the danger that lurked in the shadows. But for those whose bloodlines were marked by betrayal, the night held a different kind of terror, a terror that would soon be unleashed upon them by the vengeful spirit of Ezekiel Thorn. Chapter 5. Confrontation at the Inn. Professor Archer sat in a corner of the inn, surrounded by a sea of ancient texts and his trusty laptop. His fingers danced across the keyboard as he delved deeper into the history of Blackwood Asylum. The more he read, the more appalled he became at the brutal methods employed by the so-called doctors of the past. Barbaric, Archer muttered to himself. These so-called doctors were nothing short of monsters. Just then, a burly, tough-looking man bumped into Archer, knocking his laptop slightly off balance. "Watch where you're going, old man," the thug growled, his voice dripping with menace. "I beg your pardon," Archer said, adjusting his glasses. "But wasn't it you who just collided with me?" At that moment, 3 other men stood up from a nearby table, all with the same thuggish demeanor. "You need to watch your manners, old man," one of them sneered. Before the situation could escalate further, Damian Knight stood up from his seat at the bar, his presence commanding immediate attention. "This old one isn't worth your time," he said, his voice calm and steady. "How about we settle this outside? Just you 4 and me." The thugs exchanged glances, and sensing an opportunity, followed Damian out of the inn. The cool night air greeted them as they stepped into the dimly lit alleyway behind the inn. One of the thugs, brimming with overconfidence, charged at Damian. With reflexes that were almost superhuman, Damian sidestepped the attack with ease. "Look," Damian said, his voice carrying a hint of warning. "Obviously, someone has put you up to this. What they haven't told you is that I'm going to make this very painful, unless you tell me who." The 4 men, undeterred by Damian's words, charged at him simultaneously, but Damian was ready. Moving with speed and power that defied human limits, he dodged their blows effortlessly. In a blur of motion, he struck each thug with precision, knocking them all to the ground in seconds. One of the men, dazed and terrified, awoke to find Damian shaking him gently but firmly. "Let's you and me have a little talk," Damian said, his eyes boring into the thug's soul. The man's bravado crumbled under Damian's intense gaze. "We were paid to beat up the old man and you," he stammered, fear evident in his eyes. "Who paid you?" Damian demanded, his grip tightening slightly. "The Thorn family," the thug blurted out. "It was the Thorn family." Damian released the man, who scrambled away, clutching his bruised ribs. He turned to Professor Archer, who had followed them outside. "Looks like we've stirred up a hornet's nest, Archer. The Thorn family seems to have a lot at stake here." Archer nodded, his expression grim. "Indeed. But who are the Thorns, and why are they so desperate to keep us away?" Damian pondered this new information. "We need to dig deeper into this Thorn family and their connection to Blackwood Asylum. There's something they're hiding, and it's our job to find out what it is." With renewed determination, Damian and Archer prepared for their next move. The confrontation with the thugs had only strengthened their resolve to uncover the truth behind the Thorn family's dark secrets and the madness that plagued Holt. The hunt for answers continued, and they were ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. Chapter 6. The Asylum's Darkness. The trail led Damian Knight and Professor Archer to the foreboding structure of Blackwood Asylum. The building loomed in the night, its windows like dark, empty eyes watching their every move. With a shared glance of determination, they stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air was heavy with dust and the lingering echoes of past suffering. The walls were lined with the remnants of old decaying medical equipment and yellowed papers strewn across the floor. They made their way to the center, where Archer began to prepare a ritual to summon the entity they were hunting. Archer drew a circle on the floor with chalk, placing candles at its edges and lighting them one by one. He chanted in a low, ominous voice, invoking ancient words meant to draw the spirit from its hiding place. The atmosphere grew colder, and the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe around them. As the ritual reached its peak, a dark mist began to gather in the center of the circle. It swirled and coalesced into a form, solidifying into the twisted, parasitic figure of Ezekiel Thorn. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his presence exuded an aura of pure madness. You dare summon me? Ezekiel hissed, his voice a chilling whisper that seemed to echo in their minds. I must feed on sanity to live, to complete my mission. Damian stepped forward, his expression resolute. I can't allow this to continue. Ezekiel laughed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. You cannot stop me, he said, and with a sudden, forceful movement, he reached out and entered Damian's mind. Despite his vampiric abilities, Damian felt an overwhelming surge of madness and despair. He began to crumble, his mind assaulted by chaotic visions and the echoing screams of the insane. Archer, seeing his friend in distress, grabbed him and dragged him out of the circle. Once outside the asylum, Damian's mind began to clear. He took deep, steadying breaths and slowly regained his composure. We can't fight him directly, he admitted, frustration evident in his voice. Archer nodded. I have another plan, but first, we need to pay the Thorns a visit. After recovering from their encounter, made their way to the Thorn residence, a modest farm home on a small piece of private land, the last remnant of Ezekiel Thorn's estate. They approached cautiously, the night cloaking their movements. Damian sneaked onto the grounds, his keen eyes noticing strange symbols carved into the earth and stones around the home. He took photos of the symbols with his phone and returned to Archer, showing him the images. Of course, Archer said, realization dawning on his face. These are protection symbols. They're designed to keep something out and keep the family safe. Quickly looking up information on his laptop, Archer found an old record. Ezekiel Thorn, a patient of the asylum. This was his land. They claimed he was mad, but was he? Damian frowned. What are you suggesting? Archer looked up from his screen. We need to remove the symbols. Damian objected. We need to find a way to stop this thing, not just expose the family to danger. Archer shook his head. This is how we stop it. The symbols are keeping Ezekiel's spirit out, but they're also keeping us from fully confronting and dealing with him. If we remove them, we can draw him here and find a way to end this. Damian hesitated, but then nodded. All right, let's do it, but we need to be prepared for anything. With a shared look of determination, they set about their task. The night was far from over, and the true battle against Ezekiel Thorn was just beginning. Chapter 7. Unveiling the Truth. As Damian set off to remove the symbols around the Thorn residence, Professor Archer continued his research on his laptop. The Thorn family history was elusive, shrouded in secrecy. However, Archer managed to uncover a long lineage of corruption, a family marked by harshness and cruelty. Stories of beatings, mistreatment of servants, and other acts of cruelty painted a grim picture of a family almost cursed by their own actions. A short time later, Damian returned, his expression grim. I got all the ones I could find. Archer looked up, concern etched on his face. I think we may have just condemned them all to madness. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the night. Damian and Archer rushed towards the Thorn home, their hearts pounding. By the time they arrived, it was too late. The aging members of the Thorn family lay on the floor, lifeless. The protection symbols had kept Ezekiel out, but with them removed, his vengeance had been unleashed. Look out, screamed Archer as Ezekiel Thorn's spectral figure materialized before them. Damian prepared to fight, but a calm voice halted his movements. It was the voice of Ezekiel Thorn. Stop, Ezekiel said, his tone surprisingly serene. My vengeance is now sated. Damian and Archer stood still, listening intently. Ezekiel continued, My family sent me to the asylum to steal my land and fortune. They declared me mad to rid themselves of me. Their greed drove them to betray their own blood. He glanced at the fallen Thorns, his expression one of sadness rather than anger. The current family knew of the curse I placed upon them, and those at the asylum. They dabbled in black magic to keep me out and hide from my sight, continuing the legacy of evil through their greed. Ezekiel's eyes met Damian's. I no longer seek vengeance. I will now rest in peace. I have fed all I need to feed. I will be a permanent part of the asylum. Do not come there. Should anyone disturb my rest, I will destroy them, for no one can stop madness. With that, Ezekiel's form began to fade, a peaceful smile spreading across his face. The air around them grew still, the oppressive weight of his presence lifting. Damian and Archer stood in silence, processing what they had just witnessed. The dark legacy of the Thorn family had come to an end, and Ezekiel's spirit was finally at peace. Let's go, Damian said quietly. Our work here is done. They left the Thorn residence, the night air now feeling lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted from the village of Holt. As they walked away, the outline of Blackwood Asylum loomed in the distance, a silent reminder of the darkness that once resided there. Ezekiel Thorn's warning echoed in their minds. The asylum was now a resting place for a tormented spirit, one that demanded to be left alone. Knew they had to respect his final wish, but their journey was far from over. The world was full of darkness and creatures that preyed on the innocent, and they would continue their fight against it. For now, though, they had brought peace to one tormented soul and ended a cycle of vengeance and madness. The night was still, and the promise of a new dawn gave them hope for the battles yet to come.